Welcome, everyone. My name is Roger Cooley. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. We're very excited to be co-hosting this year with Cook County Public Health, the Cook County Food Summit, an annual event, which obviously we had the transition to a virtual event this year, but very excited for the opportunity to bring in lots of different leaders from across the country and the region, and looking forward to getting started this morning. We've got this initial screen sharing what's going on with how to navigate the Zoom workshop. Right now we're starting with a webinar format. So if you'd like to rename yourself and add your pronouns, as well as if you have any organizations you'd like to link to, that'd be great. But we'd like to start this morning with a land acknowledgement recognizing the heritage and history of the area that we're in now. And so we'll start with a short video and then we'll move more directly into personal land acknowledgement.
Before I begin this morning, I'd like to recognize the Algonquin Nation, on whose traditional territory we are gathering. We acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land.
Wherever I go on God's green earth, I do the Lakota tradition of acknowledging the four directions, the land, and the people living there. Unchimaka, as I call Grandmother Earth, the land, I view her as a sacred, living entity, and that's the way we acknowledge it in, Lakota thought and philosophy.
As a Native person, I'm ready for any kind of confrontation that might come up, or I'm preparing myself to remind people of all those things that they forget about. I was at a meeting in Minneapolis, and the room was primarily non-Native people. I was in a non-Native organization, but this executive director got up and said, "Okay, we're gonna get started." So everybody, was sitting down and getting quiet. And she said, "I'd like to get started by acknowledging the indigenous culture of Minnesota." And I was like, whoa. And it just made everything fall away a little bit from me. My guard went down, I was more relaxed. Because by saying that, that means she understands something that is just you can't talk about, right? It just relaxed me as a minority, as a woman, and as a Native person. It just pulled away this layer that's always there, It was super cool.
We're at a time where non-Native cultures are understanding the traditions of indigenous peoples for probably the first time in our histories. So when I go to New Zealand, the protocol is to acknowledge each other's ancestors and your mountains and your rivers. And that's such a beautiful tradition. When people are in that space and say, we acknowledge who you are, this land, where your people come from, they're saying we acknowledge a relationship, but we're also creating that relationship. This is a good thing.
The important thing would be that folks would then sit with that. What does it mean that our settlement is occupying this space? And what responsibility do I have considering that legacy to these contemporary things, right? And how do I stop distancing myself from that? Ideally, that would be, for me, the impact that this has.
If you start acknowledging that the land that you're standing on and the space that you are in belong to people that are still here, issues. It's one of those little things that if it could just tip a little bit, all the dominoes that could fall from it, I think are important.
Now I'm imagining it and like wanting to live in that, like the thing that I'm imagining, like, yeah, that's actually really beautiful.
It's just being a genuine human being to acknowledge each other's histories, the good and the bad.
Great. And we wanted to welcome Heather Hathaway Miranda, who will be sharing a more localized land acknowledgement, recognizing the heritage here. She's an award-winning international speaker with over 15 years of experience as a researcher and educator. Heather is also a trainer and facilitator of racial healing circles with the Truth, Racial Healing, and Reconciliation work. So thank you, Heather.
Thank you. Good morning, buenos dias. It is my honor to be here to offer these words. We would like to acknowledge that Chicago is the traditional homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Odawa. It is the site of trade and healing for the Miami, Ho-Chunk, and Sauk. The word Chicago is a native-based word. Every time we speak it, we are speaking of the original people. The region is located at the intersection of several great waterways, leading the area to become the site of travel and healing. These tribes and many others served as stewards of the land before us. Today, 65,000 indigenous people live, work, and play alongside us here in Chicago. May we learn to respect and honor their historical and contemporary presence, and their belief that we must recognize our roles as caretakers of the lands and waters for the use and livelihood of future generations. May we commit ourselves to developing deeper partnerships that advocate for the progress, dignity, and humanity of the many diverse Indigenous Americans who still live and practice their heritage and traditions on this land today. I want to share a few words about Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Since 2017, Chicago TRHT, Greater Chicago, has worked alongside more than 100 skilled practitioners, like Roger mentioned, being a racial healing practitioner, from different backgrounds and disciplines to co-develop a methodology for facilitating racial healing circles. TRHT believes that we need to acknowledge and speak the truth about the inequity created by individual and systemic racism in order to address the present consequences. Land acknowledgements are part of that healing when we speak of and honor the original people. Racial healing circles are an experience and a tool to connect people, help foster, build, and foster trust and build authentic relationships that bridge those divides. It's essential to pursue racial healing prior to doing change-making work. Before we do policy work and systemic change work, we must do people work. So the circles create a sacred space where racial, cultural, ethnic identity is honored. And it's a part of listening, reflecting, and humanizing all people. So if you're interested in more information, please check out the website for transformshy.com. These racial healing circles sponsored by TRHT are a part of the Woods Fund and the Kellogg Foundation. But we also want to draw attention, there's a grant application for all non-for-profits to apply for racial healing work, and TRHT wants to be a part of that. There's $4.5 million in grants available now through the Illinois Department of Human Services. So if you're interested in that, please check out healing.illinois.gov. Thank you so much for honoring our original inhabitants.
Thank you so much, Heather, for taking the time out today to share the land acknowledgement and more information about TRHT. We're excited about that process, and please follow up and look for those resources. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we're going to be transitioning to a video welcome from President Tony Preckwinkle of Cook County Board of Commissioners. We're very excited to have her leadership and support for this event and the work moving forward. So please hear the words from President Preckwinkle. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to the 5th Annual Food Summit. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Cook County Department of Public Health and the Chicago Food Policy Action Council for organizing this event. I would also like to thank Cook County Commissioners Anaya, Deere, Johnson, and Degnan, who will provide the welcome tomorrow on day 2. Finally, I would like to acknowledge Deborah Carey, Interim CEO of Cook County Health, for being here today to talk about the great work they are doing to address food insecurity among their patients. I'm grateful to all of you. You may be wondering why we're holding a food summit in the middle of a pandemic. The reason is that this crisis and its economic consequences have laid bare the deep health inequities and social injustices that we see in our food system. Higher death rates, harsher economic impacts, and lack of access to healthy food are just a few of the inequities in Black and brown communities that reveal how structural racism, targeted disinvestment, and concentrated power directly undermine public health. Abrupt market changes have greatly disrupted the flow of food during the pandemic. They demonstrate just how susceptible our long, rigid supply chains are to collapse. This year's Food Summit will focus on building a more equitable and sustainable food system in Cook County. National and local experts will highlight strategies and best practices for advancing a more equitable food system through a series of panel discussions, workshops, and virtual field trips. Over the next few days, there will be an opening keynote by Paula Daniels, co-founder and chief of What's Next at the Center for Good Food Purchasing, workshops and listening sessions for farmers, food businesses, public health practitioners, environmental and labor rights advocates, and interested community members who want to grow a better local food system. There will even be virtual tours of sustainable farms and exciting community-driven food projects across Cook County. At Cook County, we recognize the important role of government in cultivating local and regional food systems and in providing good food access to all. That's why we were the 3rd local government in the United States to approve a Good Food Purchasing Program, GFPP. This resolution passed in May of 2018. The Cook County Department of Public Health and the Chicago Food Policy Action Council were charged with implementing this program. Later today, they will provide an update on our progress. This program intersects with several policy priorities in the Cook County Policy Roadmap, my 5-year strategic plan, released in October of 2018. This program uses an equity lens as we endeavor to use in all of our policies and programs. It recognizes the county has a great deal of buying power in terms of procurement. Procurement is a moral process when it comes to equity, sustainability, and community resiliency. The Good Food Purchasing Program is more important now than ever. The program proactively addresses these issues by building community wealth, expanding workplace safety and workers' rights, and ensuring good food is accessible to everyone. Cook County is committed to good government practices that build transparency, advance racial equity, and support inclusive economic growth. Public food procurement is one of the tools that Cook County government can leverage to invest in these goals, while also positively impacting the health of meal recipients in Cook County Health, the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, and the Cook County Sheriff's Office. Altogether, Cook County purchases more than $15 million annually through these agencies. The county also recognizes that the demand for local, sustainable, fair, humane, and healthy food can have a broader ripple effect throughout the region. We have the power to positively affect small local farms and food businesses, especially those owned by people of color. People of color can leverage this demand to access resources, raise capital, and scale their operations. Other public and private institutions, both here and in Cook County and across the country, are watching. They are looking at how we implement the Good Food Purchasing Program. This is a model for change. I'm very proud of the work we are doing and hope you enjoy hearing more about it over the next few days. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Deborah Carey, Interim CEO of Cook County Health. Thank you.
Thank you, President Preckwinkle. My name is Deborah Carey, and good morning, everyone. I am the Interim Chief Executive Officer of Cook County Health. I'd like to thank Dr. Kiran Joshi, Dr. Rachel Rubin, and their team, as well as the Chicago Food Policy Action Council and other sponsors of today's annual Food Summit for their hard work in putting together the summit. We at Cook County Health are very pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of the annual event and thank all who are participating today. Again, thank you, President Preckwinkle, for your dedication and ongoing support to address food insecurities, health equity, and improving health outcomes. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the commissioners who will be participating in the Food Summit, Commissioners Anaya, Commissioner Deere, and Commissioner Johnson. And I commend them on their work and advocacy to improve the health and wellness of the residents of Cook County. Cook County Department of Public Health is part of Cook County Health. And Cook County Health is one of the largest public health care systems in the nation. Our mission is to deliver integrated health services with dignity and respect, regardless of a patient's ability to pay. The pillars of Cook County Health's current and last strategic plans are to impact social determinants and also advocate for patients. We seek to create partnerships with other health providers and communities to enhance the health of the public. We also advocate for policies that promote the physical, mental, and social well-being of the people of Cook County. And of course, providing food security is a major component of that. I'm grateful to the Cook County Department of Public Health for bringing the community and partners together today to talk about this important issue. Food is medicine, and we need to ensure that residents in Cook County have access to the food so that they lead and can continue to have healthier lives. The discussions during this summit directly aligns with the work that we are doing every day at Cook County Health. We know that 1 in 7 people in Cook County will experience food insecurity this year. We also know that at least 30% of Cook County Health patients are experiencing food insecurity. That's 30% of our patients are experiencing food insecurity. And that can exacerbate chronic diseases and result in poor health conditions and outcomes. That number has increased, of course, during the pandemic. In the last several years, our clinics have begun screening patients for food insecurity, recognizing the linkage that food insecurity has to health care. With so many of our patients either uncertain about where their next meal will come from or living in food deserts, we are grateful to area partners for assisting us in making sure that healthy foods are accessible to everyone. We would also like to recognize the many community groups and organizations who have recently sponsored distribution sites to ensure the most vulnerable have access to food during this pandemic. We acknowledge that during these economically difficult times, families are even more stressed to obtain adequate food. Back in 2015, Cook County Health began working with the Greater Chicago Food Depository to produce fresh produce to patients who might not normally have access to fresh food. The Greater Chicago Food Depository fresh trucks visit our Cook County Health community clinics, which are located around Cook County, and they, through those trucks, have provided fresh fruits and vegetables to nearly 27,000 individuals, which represents more than 89,000 household members and totals more than 550,000 pounds of fresh produce. Yet we do know we can do more. But we are also very proud that we've been able to host produce markets in our clinics thanks to fresh foods that have been supplied by Black Oak Center, a nonprofit that seeks to create a just, holistic, and local food system through education, entrepreneurship, and access to healthy, affordable foods. They're a great partner that we have. We also partner with the Experimental Stations Illinois Link Up, Link Match program to offer SNAP users a match on all purchases at Cook County Health Fresh Markets up to $20 per market per week. As you will hear this afternoon, Cook County Department of Public Health is implementing the Good Food Purchasing Program, as was also just described by President Preckwinkle. Cook County Health is among the Cook County departments and agencies working with Cook County Department of Public Health to transform the ways in which we procure food. Because we have so many touch points throughout the county, we believe the health system is in a unique position to understand the role food plays in preventing, developing, or resolving chronic diseases from a variety of angles. We know that food is critical to health, and we will continue to work with you with the belief and the knowledge that food is medicine. And with that, I thank you for allowing me to give you a few minutes this morning. And I will turn it back over to Roger Cooley. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Deborah. That's a powerful statement from you and President Preckwinkle, recognizing and acknowledging all the partnerships and work that it takes to deal with the current situation of COVID and that additional health crisis, but the ongoing issues of access to healthy food while supporting equitable economic development through the purchasing of food that the county can provide. But real quick, before turning it over, I just wanted to mention that there is closed captioning service for simultaneous translation in the Spanish that's available at the bottom of the screen. But now I wanted to turn it over to Dr. Kiran Joshi, the Senior Medical Officer and co-lead for the Cook County Department of Public Health. Thank you, Dr. Joshi.
Thank you so much, Roger. Good morning, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here with you all. On behalf of the Cook County Department of Public Health, welcome. We have a very exciting morning and a couple of days planned for you all, and we really hope you get a lot out of it. I'd like to thank you, Roger, as well as your colleagues, Marley Wilson, Asia Castandea, all from the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, for your help in planning this event and for your ongoing partnership. Both of our agencies have been tasked with implementing the Good Food Purchasing Program for Cook County, and we couldn't have asked for a better team. I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the phenomenal team at the Cook County Department of Public Health, including Amy O'Rourke, Gina Basuda-Barnett, Keith Wynn, George Beecham, and Kimberly Junius, all for their work on the GFPP and, of course, in planning for the summit under what I'm sure folks could understand have been some really challenging conditions at the Cook County Department of Public Health as we deal with COVID, and of course for our country in general. I'm going to share with you just a little bit about CCDPH, some of the work that we do, some of the work we've done around COVID, and of course, our role in the GFPP. So next slide. We are the state certified health department for 2.5 million people and 127 Chicago suburbs. Each of those, if you can imagine, has their own mayor. And the result of this is that we have a very complex jurisdiction, and it's very diverse in terms of the populations we serve, as well as the physical size and the geography of it. We've got 700 square miles. So we practically, as a practical matter, we cannot do our work in isolation. And we're really proud to work with many partners across our jurisdiction to advance our mission, which is advancing health equity in suburban Cook County. Next slide. So you can see that, so I'm sure folks are aware that suburban Cook County is home to some of the wealthiest folks and the poorest folks in the nation. And racially, it has been growing more and more diverse. And this is a good thing. I think it's really a part of the what makes suburban Cook County such a beautiful tapestry. Between 2010 and 2017, the population of Black and Brown folks in suburban Cook County increased by 12%. Our white population during that same time frame did decrease by about 6%. Now, while the diversity, again, is really a beautiful thing, the health inequities that we know exist in our jurisdiction by race and by place are certainly something that are not good and that we work on the daily at CCDPH to address. So next slide. Policies and practices that have systematically disadvantaged people of color and benefited their white counterparts. And some examples of these are unfair housing practices and low minimum wage and a lack of paid sick leave. All of these policies and practices have generated the unfair and avoidable differences in health outcomes that we see in our jurisdiction. And so here, and I think what we're seeing here is a map of median household incomes with the orange and blue dots representing life expectancy. The median household income ranges from over $200,000 to a little over just $20,000 a day. And I think most would agree that in this age, that is certainly not a livable wage. Next slide. So this is just a slide, again, sort of showing you our jurisdiction. Just as a practical matter, we do divide it up into 4 regions. And on the right-hand side, you see some of the larger units or departments in our agency. And of course, our goal is to attain health equity for everyone in suburban Cook County. Okay, next slide. So just a quick catchphrase that summarizes what public health is and what we do. Fundamentally, we are here to promote health, to prevent disease, and protect the residents of our jurisdiction. Next slide. So this slide sort of summarizes our COVID-19 response. Just by the numbers, I would want folks to be aware that we have investigated thousands upon thousands of cases of COVID-19 and the individuals in our agency that perform contact tracing and some of our epidemiologists have worked to provide guidance regarding quarantine isolation and other prevention measures. We've investigated cases and provided technical assistance to more than 200 congregate settings. This is really challenging work that requires a high degree of subject matter expertise because, for example, in places like nursing homes, individuals can have coexistent multi-drug resistant infections, and managing those infections along with COVID-19 is a big challenge. Of course, we do a lot of work that's public facing, and the good folks staffing our hotline have responded to, I believe at this point, over 10,000 inquiries. And our staff who are also working hard to respond to inquiries from businesses have responded to many thousands of those as well, providing, again, really highly individualized guidance. Next slide. So this pandemic has really highlighted in bold relief the inequities that we in public health are very familiar with. And this is particularly apparent in our south and west suburbs. If you look at the map on the left, it's a map of where we've seen over the course of the last months the most COVID-19 cases, the highest rates of cases, that is. And you can see that the red circles are sort of around the near west and the south suburbs. And I would submit that if one were to look at a map of most health outcomes ranging from diabetes to, the things that happen once you have heart attacks, like all of those would show a similar pattern. And the reason for that, if you look on the right, is that these are the areas in suburban Cook County that have been made particularly vulnerable by the policies that I mentioned earlier. So among them are policies that have led to increased rates of things like food insecurity and availability and access to good food. And we're hoping that ultimately the GFPP will work to rectify some of these inequities. Next slide. Okay. So I think looking at it now by race rather than just by place, there are considerably higher rates of COVID-19 illnesses and death amongst African Americans and Latinx folks. And in suburban Cook County, the rate per 100,000 Black residents is 3 times higher than that of their white counterparts. And the rate for Latinx residents is almost 4 times higher than that of whites. So again, this is not surprising to those of us in public health that we would see this same pattern with COVID-19 that we've seen in many other illnesses. We know that Latinx folks and African-American folks have historically been disproportionately affected by heart and lung disease and many, many other conditions. All of these put folks at increased risk for more severe illness and potentially death from COVID-19. And again, I would reiterate, and it's sort of like if there's one thing that you would walk away from my comments this morning with, it's that these health outcomes are the result of years of racist policies. Again, things like redlining, limited access to health insurance and healthcare, and community disinvestment. And that COVID-19 is simply revealing those disparities. And we're deeply concerned in public health that COVID-19 is going to worsen or deepen those disparities even further if we don't all work together to address them. This is a societal problem, and I think it's going to require societal solutions. Next slide. So despite all of this, despite all that's happening in our across the world, in our country, and in our region, we felt it was very important to move forward with the annual food summit and continue working to improve access to healthy foods. I think they're a really crucial part of the puzzle. So the Good Food Purchasing Program is a nationally known program, and it provides a metric-based framework for food procurement that supports institutional food buyers to make informed decisions and measure impact in 5 value categories. So those categories are local economies, environmental sustainability, a valued workforce, animal welfare, and nutrition. And really, as President Preckwinkle said earlier this morning, this program harnesses the county's significant power of procurement. Cook County departments and agencies, including Cook County Health, the Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, and the Sheriff's Office, spend more than $15 million a year on food. The Cook County Board approved this resolution in May 2018, and it was championed by many, many folks across the county and on the Cook County Board, one of whom was Jesus Chuy Garcia, who at the time was a Cook County Commissioner and chaired the Commission on Social Innovation. This resolution established a Cook County Good Food Task Force and mapped out the process for policy implementation with our partners at the Center for Good Food Purchasing and the good folks at the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. Next slide. CCDPH partners with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, or CIFPAC, as we affectionately call it, to collect data and information from county departments and agencies to first understand current food purchasing practices. This data and information are all shared with the Center for Good Food Purchasing for analysis, and a baseline assessment is conducted. CCDPH and CIFPAC will work to support each department to develop a multi-year plan and take action to move towards transforming our local food system to be more equitable, healthier, and more sustainable. We'll also work with county departments and agencies to explore opportunities to incorporate GFPP standards into their respective purchasing and procurement processes. Over time, Cook County food vendors will work to meet high good food standards in each of the categories that I mentioned earlier. And the hope is that this will lead to a healthier Cook County where every resident has an opportunity to thrive. CCDPH and CIFPAC also convene the Cook County Good Food Task Force. This is the Cook County government task force responsible for overseeing the implementation of the GFPP. The task force meets quarterly. It discusses challenges, shares solutions, celebrates successes, and works to identify opportunities to advance the GFPP. The task force includes county department and agency leaders and key food system stakeholders. We look forward to sharing more about this, as well as our progress during the opening plenary later this afternoon. So that concludes my comments for the morning. Once again, welcome everyone. We're really looking forward to a wonderful and productive food summit this year. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. We're very appreciative of your partnership and leadership in this work, and very excited for moving forward in the next year. As Dr. Joshi mentioned this afternoon, the next session will be at 1:30, and we'll be hearing from panelists from the JDCTC, the Juvenile Detention Center facility, other staff from the Department of Public Health as well, who will be giving updates on all the other work that's been happening with good food purchasing over the last few years. So thank you so much. We'll be transitioning now to our keynote speaker. Very excited to have Paula Daniels with us, but a couple of reminders. One, again, that there's closed captioning available for live translation into Spanish. And also, as we go through the process, if folks have questions that they'd like to follow up with Paula as we move forward, please use the Q&A button at the bottom for putting in your questions. They'll get organized. We'll try to find common ones, and people have the opportunity to actually prioritize different questions. And so at the end of her talk, we'll follow through with some of those questions. But also, real quick, would also like to thank some of our partners and staff from the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, again, with all the staff that Dr. Joshi mentioned from the CDPH. I wanted to thank Candace Clark for her technical prowess, for navigating us through this new virtual reality that we're working through, the leadership of Marley Wilson, the support of Asia Castaneda, Raj Sheikh, Steph Funk, Enrique Orozco, and Dakari Howard. Thank you all so much for your time and energy to make this possible. But now I would like to welcome Paula Daniels. She's been a very close partner the last few years, and very excited that she was able to work with us, and has been very instrumental in helping to develop some of the original concepts and practices and the advocacy to help make the original Good Food Purchasing Program a reality in Los Angeles, and has now become an advocate and passionate supporter for the national spread and adoption of the policy across the country. She's the co-founder and chief of What's Next and chair of the board of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. Paula, thank you so much for being here, and very excited to hear what you have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. I want to make sure you all can hear me okay. So it's wonderful to be part of this summit, and I do want to thank you all for inviting me to be part of it. I really appreciate the comments of the speakers that have just come before me. Dr. Joshi, you're so right that this is a societal problem that requires societal solutions, and we're so pleased that you were able to adopt the Good Food Purchasing Program in Cook County. It's been phenomenal to see how well Cook County and Chicago are leading in this effort. President Preckwinkle has been a leader for quite some time in this area. Really appreciate her commitment to this program and the groundbreaking Cook County resolution that was passed some time ago. The Chicago Food Policy Action Council, Roger, Marley, the whole team, you've done tremendous work in advancing these ideas, in advancing us toward a good food system, and also in being responsive and important during COVID. I think it really shows the power of relationships and collaborations and how important those are when you see what the Food Policy Action Council was able to do. They were able to organize folks before the orders even came to start shutting things down, and had an infrastructure ready for the Cook County and Chicago area that was really important and valuable. So I will talk today about our journey toward a good food system, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And I apologize, I haven't been able to figure out how to get my presentation up before I share screen, so you're going to have to watch me click around a little bit. So let's see, here we go. I am sharing my screen, and now I'm going to do presentation, and I'm starting with an image of the Hokulea, which is a Hawaiian voyaging canoe that was designed in the 1970s to replicate the voyaging canoes that our ancestors came from Tahiti toward Hawaii for. I'm from Hawaii, and I am part Hawaiian. I'm registered with Kauinoa as a native Hawaiian. And I want to start here as we think about our journey toward a good food system to recognize and appreciate the recognition of the indigenous peoples of this land and this country. The video in the beginning was quite beautiful. And so when I think about this journey, I feel I must draw on the inspiration of my own Hawaiian heritage and the noble tradition of ocean voyaging. So my Polynesian ancestors developed and settled the islands of the Pacific around 500 AD and established trade routes throughout the Pacific. And it's now known to the Pacific Rim of the United States. It's thought that it's believed that based on archaeological evidence and other evidence, anthropological evidence, that they sailed back and forth from the west rim of the Pacific, North America and South America, and engaged in trade and exchanged ideas. And they did all this about 1,000 years before Galileo even invented his compass. So ocean exploration is a big part, it's an indelible part of Hawaiian culture. In 1971, the Hawaii State Legislature changed Columbus Day to be called Discoverers Day. So this is 1971 that we did this in Hawaii. And it was done in honor of all discoverers, including Pacific and Polynesian navigators. So in this image, you see the star compass. So the image of the bird there is pointing toward an aspect of the compass. Part of the wayfaring method was using stars as a compass and using a fluency of language, of understanding of nature, the language of nature, of understanding the wind and the waves in order to navigate. Oh, sorry. So this is an image of Nainoa Thompson, who's a contemporary of mine, 2 years ahead of me in my high school. And he's the one who helped revive Hawaiian wayfaring, which had almost been lost. It was lost as our language had been lost. But it was, we experienced a Hawaiian Renaissance in Hawaii in the 1970s, where the Constitution was amended to bring back the Hawaiian language as an official language and resurrected a number of traditional Hawaiian values, including caring for the earth, and the idea of being in a relationship of trust with the earth was embedded into the Constitution. And Nainoa Thompson helped resurrect the almost lost tradition of Hawaiian voyaging. So that's a picture of him on the top using his hand to measure the distance. And you can see him doing it again in the bottom, the distance of the sun to the horizon in order to help develop his navigation points. So he has a saying, which I've put on the side, and I think it's relevant to what we have to think about in terms of our food system. It's certainly relevant to navigation, that you only know where you are in this kind of celestial navigation, which is an intimate knowledge of the relationship of the stars and the way the wind and the water works. You only know where you are in this kind of navigation by memorizing where you sailed from, because where you sailed from gives you all the information about where you are and where you want to be. So I'm going to start talking about our food system, but also start by talking about our food system by telling you a bit about where I'm from, which in and of itself will be a story of modern agriculture and food systems. So this is a picture of my ancestors. On the left is Henry Wilson Daniels, who came to Hawaii in the 1850s and married Nancy Hana Kamaikalani Kopp. So she was a daughter of a chiefess. So she was in the royal lineage of the Hawaiian kingdom, which was its own sovereign kingdom until 1893. And on the right of the screen is William Henry Daniels. That's an excerpt from Wikipedia. There's a Wikipedia page on him because he was a notable figure in Hawaii. He was among the last to be in office, but he was a judge and a lawyer. He was educated at Oxford and came back to Hawaii to become a judge in Wailuku. And then he was elected to be a member of the House of Representatives to the Kingdom of Hawaii, and our family had close relations with the monarchy there. When there was the overthrow of the Hawaiian government in 1893, there was an illegal military coup against the Hawaiian government. William Henry Daniels refused to take the oath of office to the self-installed provisional government and lost his position and ended up being assigned to work in the ditches. The overthrow of the Hawaiian government by the American military was for purposes of developing Hawaii for sugar. So after William Henry Daniels went from having his own 35-acre farm and being a judge, a lawyer, and a congressman, and a businessman, to working in the ditches of the irrigation field, the next generations of Daniels were raised on the sugar plantation. So up the upper left-hand corner here, you see a picture of my father. He's the little boy rubbing his eyes, and my grandmother and my aunt. There it's in front of their house. They were on the Punane sugar plantation camp. It was a humble camp, Iolani Palace, which I showed you in the previous slide. I'm going to go back to it. And Hawaii had been a very modern area of the world. There was actually electricity at Iolani Palace before there was electricity at the White House. Iolani Palace was electrified in 1888. We had a very progressive king who embraced modern technology, King David Kalakaua, and he also lit Honolulu with streetlights, electric streetlights, well before the White House ever had electricity at all. So electric streetlights came up in around 1888. And I think the White House had electricity, but didn't quite use it until 1891. So I point that out because of the shift that happened after the overthrow and Hawaii being taken over for agriculture. So most of the people of Hawaii worked in plantation camps, and a lot of immigration opened up then. So I have the mix of immigrants that came from Portugal and Korea and China and Germany also in my blood. So everyone worked on the plantations. That was the economy of Hawaii. And this particular plantation camp did not have indoor plumbing, even though that was available worldwide. It didn't have indoor plumbing, and there was a hose connected through a hole in the wall for bringing water into the house. So that was what was available at the time. It improved over time, but that was when my dad was growing up. It was hard work, a lot of environmental impacts from sugarcane, a lot of hard work for the laborers, and most of the jobs in Hawaii were in the fields and factories. So this picture on the bottom left is the Punane sugar mill, where my grandfather was the maintenance engineer, and it was all for sugar, which you can see on the bottom right. That's a very modern picture of CNH sugar. CNH stands for California and Hawaii. So we grew the sugar. It was shipped to the mainland, California, for milling, and then we could only consume it when it came back, and at much, much higher prices. So Hawaii became an export economy, obviously dominated by sugar and pineapple. And what was this sugar for? Let's again look back at where we're coming from. This is the near shore from where we launched in the food system. I think you all understand what happened with the rise of overprocessed food and what it meant. The mid-century was the time when many of these strategies started coming into play in terms of global food production and export economies imposed on agricultural communities around the world. Our food system before 1955, I think many of you know this already. You're here because you know this, but I'll just give a quick summary. Again, the landmark of the shore that we just sailed from. Was it before 1955? And I'm picking that because that's the year I was born. It's also a mid-century point. There were the healthiest diets in low-income Americans, probably because they grew their own food and had more access to the food from the ground, more directly from the ground, and obesity rates were low. There was very diversified food production. Most of the American workforce was in agriculture, and the farm output was coming along, but it's done by a lot of very diverse farms. And then after that, we had high rates of cardiometabolic disorders, obviously from the change in what we were producing as countries and worlds in terms of food. But what this story also tells is a story of consolidation, that production ended up being consolidated into a few hands. And chicken here is just one example. This is true for many things. But you can also see that the percent of the US workforce in agriculture shrank. So it meant that it became more efficient, meaning highly industrialized, and the farm output increased with less farms. So it became larger, highly industrialized, vertically integrated and consolidated farming, to the point where Pop-Tarts, which were developed in 1964, as you saw, have become our cultural export. This is a picture I took when I visited Berlin, Germany in 2014, and I went to the 8th floor of a very luxury high-end department store called Katave. It's sort of like a Harrods or along those lines. And I was looking at the international gourmet food section. So there were these beautiful salamis and cheeses in the Italian section, wines, cheeses, mustards in the French section. You get the idea. I'm so excited to see what they have for America. I turn the corner and this is what they have. And I was a little too stunned to take even more pictures, but everything in the American section was this overly processed packaged food. That has become our signature and our global export, which is starting to change diets worldwide. I've already mentioned this, but really just using this again as a compass point from where we came. Business as usual from the mid-century of the United States was a highly extractive system. And a lot of this is derived from Cold War economics. It was global competition that the politics of the time supported this type of food production. But we know now that we've sailed through this, let's call it the Bermuda Triangle of our food system, and we know where we want to be, which is toward a healthier food system. But what we have to start doing is rethinking how we do, how we create our food system, which is what the Good Food Purchasing Program is about. I'll talk about in a second, and what the Chicago Food Policy Action Council is all about. And I want to mention that this is a very common issue throughout most of the United States. What do Hawaii and Iowa have in common? Well, I gave you the answer on the bottom, but one thing I will say is Hawaii actually has 11,000 square miles. So not all of that is land. Half of Hawaii is an ocean state, but it does have the territory of oceans around it. And it's definitely part of our food system because we do fish that system and also use it for energy and recreation and many other things. But what do Hawaii and Iowa have in common? They rely about 90% on imported food. This is true also of California, which grows the country's vegetables. It's a highly productive Central Valley in terms of food production, but we have all of our regions have developed in a way in the 20th century so that we're very dependent on imported food. Most places it's 90%. And I know that's very true in Iowa. There's the Iowa Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, which was developed in order to support the local food movement because in there, they say they're losing 25 acres of farmland every day to development. 5 tons of topsoil per acre are blowing or washing away. They import 90% of their food, as I mentioned, and yet they have enough fertile land to grow their food. But the same is true in Hawaii. It became an export economy. And once sugar stopped being produced in Hawaii, most of that land was given over to tourism. And Hawaii right now is struggling to double its local food production. So the baseline is that our local food at this point in time is about 10 to 15%. There's a very smart and coordinated and determined effort to take Hawaii's food production to at least a double level, but they obviously need to build a lot of infrastructure in order to make that happen because a lot of the processing infrastructure, abattoirs and so forth left the islands when it was dominated by monoculture cropping. And it's difficult to rebuild it in an economy that isn't designed for it, but we're going to work with them with the Good Food Purchasing Program to help create that. So I'll talk about what some of those attributes are in a second, but I want to point out that climate change has made this goal even more imperative because Hawaii, you may have noticed if you've followed it in the news, that the hurricanes, because of climate change and global warming, are getting closer to Hawaii. Before they would form off the southern coast of Mexico and go down and disappear into the ocean, and now they're moving more, the water's moving them more and more toward Hawaii. So they're heading more and more toward the path, and there's been more hurricane warnings in an increasing amount over the past few years. So they really, cargo ships can't come to Hawaii, and they know that if the cargo ships stop coming to Hawaii, they'd be out of food in the grocery stores in about a week or so. So they definitely need to demonstrate for the world, actually, how a localized food system is climate resilient as well. So looking back to the compass points. So if we're just sailing out of the Bermuda Triangle of the food system, what was that shore that we left where the food system worked? And in the original Hawaiian system, pre-contact, food governance was actually by Ahupua'a, which is the watershed. It was designed around the watershed, and the watershed was equivalent to the food shed. So this is an important concept as we move forward, is what a food shed is. So it's the productive region. One thing I would point out too is that the chiefs that were given these ahupua'as to govern were not given the land to own, and nobody in Hawaii owned land at that time until 1848, just before my great-great-great-grandfather arrived in Lahaina from England. Land was not owned. It was stewarded. So the responsibility of the chief was to make sure this ahupua'a was thriving for next generations. So obviously we have private property in the world and in the United States. So that's a system that exists in balance with what we think of as public, what we think of as the public trust, and what we think of as public service and public goods. To this extent, I want to raise this question that electricity was once a private system when it was first developed, but then the government saw the need to regulate it. Hawaii, in fact, started regulating it early after Hawaii instituted electricity because they realized how valuable it was for the people and didn't want it to be run by a privatized system, so started regulating electricity. So I'm not suggesting here that there be a wholesale change in how this works, but I think we need to think about what's a public good and what's an essential service. And when it's a public good and essential service, how do we invest in that for the benefit of the public? And how do we manage that for the benefit of the public? We've certainly learned that to be an important lesson coming out of COVID. So that's really the point I want to make here. So part of that is going with an expanded agroecological frame, which in my view is the 21st century way forward. That near shore of the mid 20th century, we just pushed off from it, but we are moving forward toward a 21st century and more expanded agroecological frame where we know all the ages that we ever were. We know how to draw on this heritage wisdom that we briefly had amnesia about in the 20th century, but we're coming back to. So the 20th century had this narrower approach of food production that was locked into an industrial model. And we started expanding our view about agroecology and hearkening back to the notion of agroecology, which is similar to that principle that I shared with you from Hawaii and the Ahupua'a. And many nations and the United Nations are realizing that this is an important way to look at our food system in this agroecological context, which takes into account social and culture factors in food environments, the health of diets, and the ability to access nutrient-rich diets. It's an expanded view and an agroecological frame, which is being revitalized. This is also fully embraced by the United Nations. This is a series of icons that is taken from their agroecology food hub. You can look it up. It's a very available website that has an awful lot of information, but it points out the elements of agroecology, the key 10 elements, and you can read them for yourself here, but you can see that it brings in more than production and more than health. It brings it in together in a context of co-creation, knowledge sharing, human and social values, culture and food traditions, and many other things. I highly encourage that any of you who are interested access this site and take a look through it because it's very rich in information and ideas. And the Good Food Purchasing Program, which I was so pleased to hear you all talk about, was developed with this in mind. So when we developed it, I was a senior advisor to Mayor Villaraigosa of Los Angeles when we agreed to move forward with the initiative of creating the LA Food Policy Council. And in the back of our minds, the idea of creating it was in order to be able to use the power of the city of Los Angeles to have an agroecological relationship with the Southern California farming region and with its entire community. And with that, one of our key initiatives that I led at the time was to develop the Good Food Purchasing Program. So it's really wonderful to hear you all talk about how you're committed to it. And I think you all know the value of it. I'm just going to touch on it briefly for those who may not be familiar with it. But one of the things that was important about it and that we knew, and it just so happened that we recognized this, and Oliver DeShooter's quote here is in 2014, but we recognized and we're working toward this in early 2009, that government's leverage over the food system is through public procurement. That's the few leverage points it has. As President Preckwinkle pointed out, public purchasing is a significant power that a government has. And that is where you use the public power for public good. You know that the values that we put into the Good Food Purchasing Program are these 5 values that Dr. Joshi mentioned. It's worth touching on again, that it's the 5 values together, all 5 values working together in lockstep: nutrition, environmental sustainability, the valued workforce, local economies, and animal welfare. So we developed this over a 2-year process. So started imagining it. To me, that was the far shore of where all my work was to go. Started imagining it in 2009. We started developing it in 2010 and had it adopted in 2012. So we were developing these concepts knowing that we wanted to move toward what's now called an agroecological frame. What I want to point out is how this mirrors those 5 values mirror the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. This is a graphic that was put together by the Italian Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition and the Economist Intelligence Unit as they rated 67 countries around the world and how they were doing according to the Sustainable Development Goals. And they grouped them as it relates to the food system into these categories, which you can see how this mirrors agroecology. It also mirrors what we put together as the Good Food Purchasing Program values: nurturing communities, economic prosperity, environmental preservation, which includes healthy diets and wise food production and distribution. I'll point out that the United States is in the bottom half of ranking. Among the top are France and South Korea, and the United States is in the bottom half. It's an interesting study if you have a chance to take a look at it. So this is how the Good Food Purchasing Program ranks according toward the Sustainable Development Goals. All of these categories are valued in the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's also reflected in other purchasing pledges in the C40 cities, the WRI School Food Pledge, the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, and others. And this is agroecology in practice. These are all these places where agroecological diets are being advanced, not just for health, but also for the sake of the planet. I think you all know this, so I'm not going to spend time on it, but the Good Food Purchasing Program was developed as part of the LA Food Policy Council, which I founded. I mentioned the work on that started in 2009, and we started doing this work after we developed our plan in 2010. We started doing the work of developing the Food Policy Council. So it was definitely a multi-stakeholder working group, and a lot of minds went into reviewing this, including all those who would be the implementers of it and all those who had expertise in these different agroecological values. Another way to look at it was this is a graphic of the Food Policy Council from 2013. And we had grown at that point in time. From the time it was an idea, we had grown to where we had about 8 staff. Alexa Delwich, who many of you know, was one of them. And I think by 2013, so was Colleen McKinney. And we had a number of others, including Claire Fox and others who were my staff. And then we had all these other organizations who were part of our group. So each of these squares represents an organization that was part of our Food Policy Council, our working groups, and our network. And you can see in here, institutional good food procurement was but part of the many things that we were working on, but an important part. And once we adopted it, we started seeing the theory of change work in the way we had hoped. So the theory of change behind the Good Food Purchasing Program is about a number of those agroecological values, but also a good food economy. Because at heart, the agricultural system is an economic system. That's how it works. There are federal subsidies that support economic activity one way or the other. There are regulations on safety. There are certain regulations in other areas. But the way it functions, it's primarily economic, and the whole point of the Good Food Purchasing Program was to use the power of procurement to make market changes. So we would create market demand for good food, which is food that is healthy, affordable, fair, and sustainably produced. And to create a mid-scale level of it, we saw a good amount of that happening through farmers markets, which are direct sales and what you could think of as, say, a bicycle lane of traffic, very important, very valuable. But there's this super highway of global food and industrialized export-driven food models out there. So we wanted to create a grand boulevard, so good food at a mid-scale level that would stimulate the supply chain for small to mid-sized farmers and hopefully use the institutional purchasing power also with high volume long-term commitments that would provide some financial certainty to the farmers so they can have greater access to capital. And also create some supply chain infrastructure along the way, which would include food hubs and mission-driven distribution centers that intend to support the smaller and mid-scale economy that's localized, and also to support areas of food insecurity and institutions. So all that would create a longer-term economic viability for regeneratively and fairly produced food. So that's our theory of change. And we saw that working when it was first adopted in LA Unified School District in 2012. So in 1 year of adoption by LA Unified School District, which has about $120 million food budget, it's the second largest food district, school food district in the country. They shifted from less than 10% local sourcing of produce to an average of 60% local sourcing of produce, which redirected $12 million into the local food economy. And there are other benefits that happened from the redirection and from their adoption of the Good Food Purchasing Program, including the creation of 150 well-paying jobs along the supply chain in processing and manufacturing, greater health, and more sustainability. I think you all know this, and you can see Chicago on the map here, but because of this success, we did think it important to make our program available. So we spun it out of the LA Food Policy Council and became the Center for Good Food Purchasing in 2015. And since then, it expanded, went from LA to Oakland, San Francisco, and then Chicago through the great work of the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, and has been now is around in 20 cities around the country, including New York, and 53 institutions. And we're aggregating about $1 billion worth of annual food that we're analyzing in how it complies with the Good Food Purchasing Program. So circling back, and these are my final few slides, in what I see in this is a back to the future. So maybe circumnavigating the globe and coming back to where we started and knowing the place for the first time, but with new tools and new technology. So this is a picture on the left of Hawaiian aquaponics. On the bottom left, this is the same pond in the Kailua area, Kaneohe area of the island of Oahu, where they're managing now even today. And they have a well-managed lo'i there. And there's other forms of aquaponics that take place around the country now and the world on rooftops and in greenhouses. But it's a very ancient tradition in Hawaii. Windmills, which we in the mid 20th century, in that detour that we took with an embrace of new technology, but learning now that we need to blend our heritage wisdom about how we function as a society and how we function in relationship to the earth with our embrace of technology. So we're diversifying our energy portfolios, and we're now bringing back windmills. So I think the key here is diversification of methods. Renewable energy is a good example because we once were almost entirely dependent as a country on oil. And we now have in many places diversified renewable energy portfolios. I know in Los Angeles, we had a goal of 20% renewable by 2020, and we exceeded that. And our California is certainly doing well toward renewable energy, and Hawaii is on a path toward having really significant renewable energy. So we're using old technologies in new ways, harnessing the sun and wind in new ways. And I think that's our model going forward. This is a picture on the left of the traditional Hawaiian canoe. And Nainoa Thompson, my classmate from high school, created a version of this called the Hokulea, which he sailed around the world on a 3-year journey of Malama Hanua. But he also created a second model, the Hikianalia, which is using modern technology. There are solar panels on the Hikianalia, and it operates quite a bit of accommodations that weren't available to the ancient Hawaiians, but the craft itself is designed to work and function in the ocean exactly as the craft of the ancient Hawaiian did. And we now have a generation that Nainoa has trained of female master navigators and master navigators of a whole new generation. And there was a woman who navigated the Hikianalia from Hawaii to California for the Global Climate Action Summit in 2018, and did it ahead of a hurricane and navigated successfully away from a hurricane through a dense cloud bank and through fog, using traditional voyaging techniques with her sense of where the sun was, how the wind was working, and the waves. Only that, and nailed her path to Hawaii. At the same time, because of solar panels that did work from time to time, they were able to Instagram and tweet from the deck. So this is a layering of old and new that I think is a beautiful blend of knowing all the ages we ever were. So this is them sailing. The 3-year voyage that Nainoa Thompson did around the world ended in 2017. And the purpose of the voyage was to bring the idea of Malama Honua, caring for the earth, to the people of the world. And he met with the United Nations, he met with the leaders of South Africa, he met with many nations around the world to bring us together. And Nainoa said, when people come together around a common issue, they can accomplish great things. We need the instruments that pull our people together, not apart. This is true as well for the food system, and I know the work that you all are doing is such an important part of pulling us all together, particularly in sailing toward a just and sustainable food system. And I'll leave you with this quote from Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done. It seemed impossible to recreate the Hokulea, for Hokulea to recreate that voyage of wayfaring and sail it around the world, but it was done. So this vision of a just, sustainable, healthy food system for all, it's possible, and it will be done. And it will be done because of all of you. Thank you so much for having me here with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Paula, for taking the time and sharing your personal story and the journey that you and your family have taken to get to this place, and connecting it back to other communities around the country and the world who have had to deal with similar issues of colonialism, losing land sovereignty and food sovereignty, and the pathways to reconnect and get back to that space where there is an equitable, sustainable food system that's just for all. So thank you so much for sharing those pathways.
Thank you for having me here.
And we do have there are a few questions that I have, and some folks are starting to put some in the Q&A, and encourage folks who are still on who would like to ask some questions directly to Paula. Please put them in the Q&A. We'll start with this first one. Paula, could you speak to the generational dynamics of honoring the wisdom of elders in the community while also being able to engage youth and youth leaders in the emerging movement for food sovereignty in ways that appeal to them?
I think it's important to have all generations involved. And this is definitely something that Indigenous wisdom has a strong connection to. With my North American tribal cousins, they will always speak of the elders, and in Hawaii we speak of the kupunas, but having everyone at the table and understanding that the moment that we're at stands on the shoulders of all of those who came before us is a really important part of being able to move forward. So having everyone engaged in these discussions is important. So youth as well as elders. And what we're engaged in here is a movement. So those of us who have been part of movements will recognize that. I'm old enough to remember the protests of the 1960s. And when we have come across this moment for social justice in the United States this year, while it's different, there are strains of it that were familiar from the 1960s. And to remember what we experienced, what we went through, how we move forward is simply important in the way that Nainoa Thompson said. Know where you came from. Remember those guideposts, those navigation points, those decisions that were made, what made a difference, what could be done different. All of those things are important to recognize as we move forward.
Thank you. So as you've done this work on GFPP, and as it's, the big congratulations for getting the 20 different institutions and cities across the country, which is a huge victory.
We have an amazing team of people, and it includes local partners, and it couldn't be done without everyone. There's one more Hawaiian saying I will give you. I'm going to try and say it in Hawaiian. A'oe hua o ka maya I ka la ho'okahi. No one can fruit unless all the bananas are one. So it's, in other words, it takes a team.
So with that, why do you see communities, cities, and institutions moving toward GFPP and other values-based procurement?
I think it's a helpful tool. So using the Good Food Purchasing Program tool, which Alexa Delwich was a very key part of developing, as you know. So using that tool as a way to help understand how your purchasing is going now and how it could improve it can break open the dynamic of this market-based system. It can start redirecting the purchasing dollars in the way that I mentioned. It started happening in Los Angeles. It's definitely happening in Chicago and in other places, but it helps you know where you are. Again, that point of knowing where you are, so you can see where you want to be. So it gives you a roadmap toward making those changes and starting to shift that market demand. So that's part of the value in it. Did I get at the question?
So yeah. And there's some others that I think we'll dig a little deeper as well.
Yeah.
So given your vantage point and deep study experience, what are community-based system supports that are most valuable and most possible today to accelerate the movement for more market and policy shifts needed for a more just food system?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what's really important in having the Good Food Purchasing Program work in institutions is to have the ecosystem of change around and supporting the food service provider, because they're obviously committing to take this on, but having the support through the elected officials or appointed officials that they report to, right? Every public food service institution reports to someone, and having them also hold public hearings so that everyone in the public can understand what's happening with the progress that's being made with these public dollars in a public serving institution, so that everyone participates in that process, understands what's going to happen in the public hearing, and has a chance to weigh in and discuss. And then having community-based organizations participate, understand, provide whatever support they can in that process. So that whole ecosystem of change, very community-driven, is important. There are other attributes that need to happen in order to help the food service provider do their best work, which would include having that intermediary infrastructure that I mentioned, like a food hub. It seems very critical. And where we have food hubs, they're really helpful to the institution. An example, I think you all know of the Common Market, which is coming to Chicago. So the Common Market food hub started in Philadelphia. They're also in Georgia and Texas, and they're coming to Chicago soon. And they've been able to provide that intermediary support that helps the food service institution do the values-based food purchasing that they'd like to do, so they can start shifting in that direction and change some of their practices that can help support that. There's also their contracting practices, so that's something to look at. Is the contracting practices are set up for the system, so how to upgrade them in a way that's timely and capable. They're capable and meaningful. In order to support this system is, I think, valuable as well.
So how procurement contracts are designed, implemented?
Yeah, I mentioned the high volume long-term commitment, if that's possible. So it depends on how the procurement contracts. I should mention that I'm a lawyer, so I get kind of geeky about this stuff, love digging into that kind of thing. But I also was a public works commissioner in the city of LA before I developed this initiative. Actually, I was a public works commissioner while I was developing this initiative, and oversaw, it was a full-time position, I oversaw a $2 billion department that gave out a lot of contracts. So I had my own experience in the public hearing process of that. So there are a lot of them in a very rigorous process that's designed for fairness and to make sure public dollars are spent well. But that means there's a lot of rules around them. So looking at the rules and to see how those rules could be favorable toward the smaller farmers and more favorable toward equity and so forth, as is written in the Cook County resolution, is the kind of under the hood work. You lift the hood of the car of this, and you kind of have to tinker around with the catalytic converter of it, different pieces that make it work. So some shifts could be made in those bid practices that might ultimately be more favorable toward the market for smaller and local farmers.
And you mentioned the public hearings. Is that so? Assuming that's also connected to other forms of transparency to make sure that what is being purchased and who they're purchasing from, the county institutions, as well as their sub vendors.
Sure,
the public can have more input on that process.
Absolutely, public hearings are really important. When I was a public commissioner, we presided over public hearings three times a week. And so I've presided over thousands of them. I'm just saying that to say that I've seen them in many forms and they are incredibly helpful. There may be things that the institution believes they handled and that the commissioners or whoever's in the hearing things have been worked out, and sometimes we'll learn new things when the public will show up and testify something we didn't know about because this was open to the public. So it's very valuable to be able to have that available, but it's also a way for the public to just understand what is happening. So you can track those. They're usually available on radio or live stream on a computer. Lots of ways to listen in. And transparency is important. That's what this is about.
Yeah, especially now. A
Especially
lot
now.
of things are transitioning to be online. Public
That's
processes.
right. So they're very available, and it's if you care about something, you can listen in.
More questions here. As GFPP was getting started, were there any stakeholder groups or organizations that were resistant to the program, and how did you work to overcome that resistance?
Yeah, that's a good question. There wasn't actually, and before I started the food policy initiative for the city, I was involved in green infrastructure and environmental water policy. And I will tell you that I was very used to controversy in water policy, and even in green infrastructure, I had a lot of pushback. But I'm going to credit the process of the LA Food Policy Council in having a stakeholder process and in inviting every stakeholder into the design of this program from the very beginning. So that's what we didn't get pushback because everybody was involved in the very beginning. The one issue that we would run into is, will this cost more? So that came from the institutions. And because I was very familiar with the procurement processes, we worked it out with them, and understood that what they could do is add the Good Food Purchasing Program into their bid policies and say, we've incorporated the Good Food Purchasing Program. Here's our request for proposal. Here's how much we can spend, so they could bound it by their own budgets and not have it raise their cost. That was the biggest concern. We were just coming out of recession. Remember, I told you I started doing this work in 2009. That was a great recession. So we weren't expecting, we definitely wanted to protect the budgets of the implementers, and we're mindful of that. So there were lots and lots of iterations, lots of groups involved. Alexa managed that working group and the stakeholder processes more directly than me. I had more of a supervisory role, but she managed it directly and did a brilliant job of bringing the stakeholders in, hearing their input, and incorporating it into the design of the program. So it's a 2-year process that took a lot of thought, consideration, careful design, and then we peer reviewed it extensively. So by the time we worked out all those issues and heard what they were and went toward adoption, there was no opposition. It was an unusual moment to have 100% support for something that big.
But the pre-process, the getting folks aligned, the getting folks comfortable and understanding the process before moving to adoption was really valuable for you all.
Very important. Yeah, it's what made it worthwhile. And it was on me to move it forward. I was the senior advisor. I had the ear of the mayor. I was making the recommendation to him, and I was very deeply involved in the due diligence of it. We also held many focus group sessions with implementers, food service directors, the supply chain folks, the distributors, said, here's what we're planning to do. Tell us if you see any problems. I was not going to put it was my Kuleana, it was my responsibility because it was my recommendation that was being heard. So our plan, we were doing due diligence. We were not going to put that in front of anybody to adopt if we hadn't figured out that it was all doable. So we worked it out ahead of time. That's why, I feel like I'm glad that you all are able to benefit from that pre-screening that we did with the implementers. And I'm glad to know that you're finding that the path forward, while there's obviously implementation issues in every location, but that it's a meaningful path.
Well, I think there was certainly some of the issues, or what folks would talk about. Well, one, of course, was price, because especially for schools, their budgets are incredibly tight.
Yeah.
To work with for meals. But the other issue was, well, in California, you can do anything. You can grow all this food year round. So a lot of the conversation we needed to have was like, well, actually, we're going to start where you're at now. We're not going to create unrealistic expectations, and really understand and use the tool of GFPP to help you set a baseline that's based on what reality is now, which then does, as you were talking about earlier, set the star pathway for the journey to make those changes. So being really able to leverage that as well.
Yeah, it's important to understand where the institutions are now and where the system is now. But then to have the vision of where you want it to be, and to just keep patiently and persistently working toward that.
A couple more. How can we get, or how to help support healthcare institutions and some outside of the public sphere to become more involved in purchasing local foods or value-based procurement generally?
Healthcare institutions?
Yes.
They can also adopt the Good Food Purchasing Program if they choose. There's also Healthcare Without Harm, which is a partner organization, has a procurement program as well. It's structured differently, but they have a number of hospitals in their network, and they have the same values. They've incorporated labor in now as well, and they definitely are working toward climate friendly diet. So there are a number of ways hospitals can participate. It's simply opening the door to it.
Yeah, and then how, the process of navigating away from older contracts to the newer models of more values-based focused procurement.
Mm-hmm.
Like that kind of, I guess some of it could be the culture change that needs to take place or could take place within the institutions in the procurement office.
Yeah, you'd have to work with the contract administrators and look at what their practices are. I got to know Los Angeles's well, and I know it's different in every region. But once you look at how your contracts are modeled, whether there's laws of your jurisdiction, the municipality, or even state laws that apply, where there might be obstacles, and then look at how you can make some changes in it. I think that's all very doable, very possible. And we're happy to help with that.
So it's the problem solving partnerships. And
yeah, we have a director of institutional impact, Laura Edwards-Orr, who's very focused on procurement contracts and how to make those work better. And she's preparing a toolkit, and we'll be having discussions for our community of practice around the Good Food Purchasing Program about what we're learning, and to see how we can be helpful in that regard.
Oh, that's great. And it looks like we have several members in Cook County of Practice Green Health in the area already.
Oh, good. Yeah. That's great.
So opportunities.
I would think so. I think Healthcare Without Harm has a presence here, so it'd be great to team up more here.
Yeah, and there's already
by here I mean Chicago. I'm sitting here in LA and I'm saying here, but we had our power procurement summit in Chicago last year, which is fantastic, at the South Shore Learning Center, Cultural Center. It was amazing. Yeah, that was an amazing event to be able to have nationally all those partners in one room to be able to work to collaborate and talk through all these different issues. A little change of pace. What are your favorite native Hawaiian foods? Oh, Well, I definitely like ulu breadfruit, and it's experiencing resurgence. So I do love all the canoe plants. That's what we call them, is the plants that our ancestors brought to Hawaii when they first settled it in 500 AD. So that's taro. I love taro and poi. One of my favorite dishes is lau lau, which is the taro leaves wrapped around chicken or fish and baked in an imu in the underground oven. And so I like having both, like the leafy greens and the fish. And ulu breadfruit was something that was a staple of the Hawaiian diet a long time ago, but became just sort of a backyard or a forest fruit. I remember my grandmother saying, "Oh yeah, we used to eat that all the time. We would just put it in the oven and bake it. But oh well, those were the old days," my grandmother would say. But now they're the new days again, because there's ulu cultivation throughout Hawaii. And my understanding is Patagonia Provisions has had a hand in that, and they're going to start some breadfruit cultivation as well and start marketing that. Breadfruit's amazing. Once you learn about it, it's got an awful lot of nutrients. It's a very protective food. And so I had some the other day. I made ulu fries.
Oh,
They're pretty good with ketchup, but with many other things as well.
pick your condiment.
What's that?
Pick your favorite condiment.
That's right. Mango chutney might work well with that too.
Regarding jumping back to GFPP,
Yeah.
regarding LA and the work that's been done there, how far do you feel like they've come on the original? It's progressed against the original goals of GFPP when it was implemented.
Yeah, that's a good question. They've continued with increasing their local food purchasing. So they've it'll vary, but they've increased it from 12 million, and one year it was 13 million, and I think it even went up. And the number of jobs, we mentioned 150 in that slide I showed you, is up to 220. So they're still at baseline, but that baseline, because they're $150 million institution, $120 million food budget, makes a big difference. So they're still engaged, they're still moving along. And we're moving toward more plant-based diets. It's a challenge in this time to manage for all of this. When they had to shift, there were a lot of things that we're planning with them. And then the shift toward emergency food service really changed some things. So we're circling back with them about that.
And assuming you're referencing the impacts of COVID on the food distribution and how school meals have to be implemented, especially when students aren't on campus, how has the center seen the impacts of COVID across the country in institutions trying to work on this values-based procurement work?
Yeah, Laura Edwards-Orr, our Director of Institutional Impact, has done some really good work on that and did a presentation on that recently that I would be happy to share with folks that has more detail. Of course, it's been difficult for them, and many of them are still trying to procure and are still working with the Good Food Purchasing Program and are not taking their foot off the pedal of that and are still willing to be rated. We've had more institutions even enroll in it. Fresno Unified School District enrolled in it during this time. So they're still, and we're looking at last year's data, and they're still very interested in working with the Good Food Purchasing Program. They are losing money because they depend on the reimbursements. There's been a lot of complications with waivers of certain rules from the USDA that runs the school food program. But they're still fully engaged. And we'll have to see. We don't know yet, how they're purchasing this year during COVID time will shake out. But many of them were also serving farm boxes and serving produce and tapping into those local supplies. So I think a number of them will do well still.
And this will be our last question. What brings you optimism in this work on the journey for the progress in their larger food system and making it more just over time?
I think the expansion of the conversation from it being an idea, if we talk about public procurement, the Good Food Purchasing Program itself, just that, the expansion of it from being an idea to being adopted around the country. How can I not be completely optimistic about our world when you see that this is happening in times when it's not that easy to do it? So that's just one example. but the expansion of the conversation around the world, the agroecological frame that we're seeing in the United Nations, at the, in businesses, in many conversations around the world, it gives me hope that everyone is going to take responsibility for their own actions wherever they sit, for their community, wherever they're embedded in community, to make it better, and that collectively it will make such a difference. And you, Roger, and your Chicago Food Policy Action Council, all of you all give me hope. Everyone who's on this, participating in this call right now gives me hope. We're here because we're engaged in this process of change and transformation. And that's phenomenal energy. It's phenomenal star power. That gives me a lot of hope.
Oh, thank you for the kind words, Paula. We're so appreciative of your years of leadership and your time and energy in sharing your experiences with us today and your personal history and journey to get here. So thank you so much. See how folks can give applause to virtual claps.
You can just give a shaka sign. It works. It was my great honor and privilege. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Paula. So again, thank you to Paula and all the other presenters, the warm, generous welcomes from the Cook County leadership, President Preckwinkle, Deborah Carey, the interim CEO of Cook County Hospitals and Health System, Dr. Joshi from the Department of Public Health. Thank you all so much for coming out today and presenting and sharing your wisdom. And thanks for everybody for calling in. The next session is going to start at 1:30, and it's going to be focused on what has been happening within Cook County institutions around procurement. Please also check out tomorrow's full day of sessions. We have over 12 different individual workshops. Some are being plugged on the chat right now, and a lot of them are going to cover issues that were brought up that Paula brought up as well, and opportunities in some of the collaborative projects, food hubs, culturally based foods, how other institutions outside of Cook County are working on values-based procurement, how other coalitions nationally have been working on adopting GFPP and the issues and opportunities they've been finding as well, looking at labor, looking at innovative practices for community-based practices for helping to get food out to folks outside of institutions and how those could start building up capacity locally. So very excited about all the opportunities over the next 2 days of the ongoing summit. And then Friday morning, there'll be tours of several different projects locally within Cook County that are ongoing ground-based farming projects that are doing a lot of this work on as well. And then a closing panel on Friday, at the end of the day, really focused on equity and values-based procurement. So very excited for all that's next. So thank you all again for chiming in, and the next session will start at 1:30. Thank you. And please use the SCED as well. And also thank you to Heather for the land acknowledgement as well.